Hello and welcome to Indus News with me, Usman Lone. We'll begin this hour with our top story, and that's Pakistan's Foreign Office summoning India's acting ambassador to protest after Indian attacks across the line of control. During the meeting in Islamabad, Foreign Office spokesman Mohammad Faisal condemned the targeting of innocent civilians in Azad Kashmir by Indian forces. More in this report.
Spokesman Mohammad Faisal told Charge d'Affaires Gaurav Ahluwalia that India's deliberate targeting of civilian populated areas is deplorable. He said India's violations are contrary to human dignity and international human rights and humanitarian laws. Faisal warned Ahluwalia that India's ceasefire violations are a threat to regional peace and security and may lead to a strategic miscalculation. Faisal said Indian occupation forces have continuously been targeting civilian populated areas along the line of control and the working boundaries since 2017. He urged India to respect the 2003 ceasefire arrangement in letter and spirit and maintain peace on the line of control and the working boundary. Earlier, Pakistan's military spokesman Major General Asif Ghafoor said 5 civilians and 1 soldier were martyred in the Indian ceasefire violations today. He says 6 other civilians and 2 Pakistani soldiers were wounded in the unprovoked Indian attacks on the Jura, Noseri and Shahkot sectors along the line of control. Ghafoor said 9 Indian troops were killed and 2 bunkers were destroyed in Pakistan's retaliatory fire.
Well, for more on this story, we're joined by Foreign Office spokesman Dr. Mohammad Faisal, who's in Islamabad. Dr. Faisal, welcome to Indus News. Now, Pakistan has repeatedly warned that India has been planning false flag operations to provoke a kind of escalation we saw earlier this year. What are India's motivations now when they're firing ceasefire violations at the LOC?
Yes, the Indian violations of the ceasefire line of control, the ceasefire line, continue, and last night was especially very hot, where it led to many casualties on our side and more than 9 people killed on their side when we retaliated to their unprovoked ceasefire violations and the intended targeting of civilians. We have made it clear to the Indians that any provocation would get a befitting response. As Director General South Asia and SAARC, I just called in the Indian Charge d'Affaires and lodged a strong protest of Government of Pakistan on these ceasefire violations.
Dr. Faisal, Pakistan has mounted a large diplomatic campaign against India's gross human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Does the current escalation represent an Indian attempt to distract global attention from what's really going on inside Kashmir?
You're very right that whenever things heat up for the Indian government in Srinagar and in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, they make attempts to distract international attention and they heat up the line of control. And they try to shift the focus to the line of control instead of what is going on in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where 8 million people are kept in a prison. And there's a complete communications blockade, internet blockade, telephone blockade, medicines, food supplies are not being brought to the civilians. It is a huge humanitarian disaster, and this is the Indian attempt to shift attention from what is happening in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir to the line of control.
Dr. Mohammad Faisal, thank you for joining us. That was Foreign Office spokesman Dr. Mohammad Faisal there. Now, Pakistan has condemned a recent triad made by the Bharatiya Janata Party leaders during election rallies in Haryana and Maharashtra. In a statement, the Foreign Office said the BJP has nothing to sell to their voters except maligning Pakistan. It said the anti-Pakistan rhetoric for domestic political gains must come to an end. Well, thousands of people have taken to the streets of Islamabad to show solidarity with Kashmiris. The protesters have unfurled a 5-kilometer-long Kashmir flag. Kashmiris have been living under lockdown since India revoked the territory's autonomy on the 5th of August. Now, protesters chanted slogans against India's illegal annexation of the valley, and they demanded that the Kashmir dispute be resolved according to United Nations Security Council resolutions. Well, I'm joined now by our correspondent Sumaira Khan, who's in Islamabad. Sumaira, thank you for joining us on Indus News. So what's the latest on the ground in the protests in Islamabad, Sumaira?
Yes, Usman, the whole event was organized by Kashmir Youth Council and Kashmir Liberation Council. Activists from both sides, they organized such a mega event in Islamabad. The preparation for this event was going on for almost last 4 months. So there was a collective effort from almost all walks of life that they were demonstrating their solidarity with the Kashmiri community, along with the Kashmiri community, and a delegation from the President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir that was also present at the event, and they jointly hosted the largest Kashmiri flag in Islamabad today.
Sumaira, is the support for the people of Kashmir increasing in Pakistan as India's lockdown of the occupied valley continues?
Yes, Usman, indeed. Now, there is no doubt about it. As we can see, every chunk of the society is rising above and leaving aside, rather, it's the political parties in Pakistan, they are rising above their differences, or any other, if we talk about any of the group of society, they are right now joining hands in demonstrating, in expressing their solidarity with the people of Indian occupied Kashmir, and UN must realize its role to immediately lift curfew and every kind of blackouts and lockdown in Kashmir.
Thank you, Sumaira. That was Sumaira Khan, our correspondent in Islamabad. Now, in the UK, hundreds of British Kashmiris have staged a protest in Southampton against India's illegal annexation of occupied Kashmir. The Kashmir Freedom March was held to raise awareness about India's human rights violations in the valley. Demonstrators held placards and banners saying it's time for the UN to act and stop India's torture of civilians. The protesters said abuses of power by the Indian army in the valley are unacceptable. A US congressional hearing on South Asia focusing on occupied Kashmir will be held on Tuesday in Washington. In a statement, the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asia, Brad Sherman, said the hearing will review the humanitarian situation in the valley. The statement said the hearing will focus on the valley where politicians are arrested and communications blocked. It said the hearing will also review the humanitarian situation in Kashmir and whether there are adequate supplies of basic necessities. The people of Kashmir continue to observe a shutdown as a silent protest against India's aggressive actions in the territory. Well, Prime Minister Imran Khan says Pakistan will inaugurate the Kartarpur corridor scheme on the 9th of November. In a social media post, he said construction work on the Pakistani side of the border is in its final stage. Prime Minister Khan said the world's largest Sikh temple, also known as a Gurdwara, will be visited by Sikhs from across India and other parts of the world. He said the Kartarpur corridor will be a religious hub for the Sikh community and will benefit Pakistan's local economy too. Well, a retired Major General of the British Army, Jonathan David Shaw, has said it's time for the world to give more respect to Pakistan. In an article, Shaw wrote the British royal couple's visit to Pakistan shows how the country has transformed its internal security situation. The retired Army General said Pakistan has established internal order under the military command of General Qamar Javed Bajwa. He said Pakistan is working as a vital regional player and has arrested all militants on the US watch list on its territory. Shaw said Pakistan has made huge efforts against terrorism in the past decade and now is not the time to ask more from the country. Now, 2 days ahead of the end of the US brokered ceasefire, and Turkey says Kurdish fighters are withdrawing from the border town of Ras Al Ain in northern Syria. The Turkish Defense Ministry said a convoy of 86 vehicles has departed from the safe zone area. It said Turkish armed forces are closely monitoring the withdrawal. Meanwhile, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Operation Peace Spring was launched to ensure national security. Speaking in Istanbul, he said Ankara will bring peace in Syria with its partners. US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper says a peace agreement with the Taliban is the best way forward for Afghanistan. Esper arrived in Kabul a short while ago for an unannounced visit and will meet Afghanistan's leaders and US troops. Speaking to reporters, Esper said the US still wants a political agreement that would secure its objective of preventing terrorist attacks from Afghanistan. He said that the US could cut its troop numbers in Afghanistan to 8,600 from the current 14,000 without compromising counter-terrorism operations. Meanwhile, the EU's ambassador to Afghanistan, Roland Kobia, has called for a ceasefire in the country. Kobia said a ceasefire could boost the chances of a resumption of dialogue with the Taliban. In Afghanistan, 3 policemen have been killed in a suicide bombing on the motorcade of central Wardak province Governor Muzaffaruddin Yamin. Officials said Governor Muzaffaruddin Yamin escaped unhurt. Another police officer was wounded in the attack. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Hello and welcome back. Now, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has sent a request to the EU for an extension to Brexit, but without his signature. The request was accompanied by a second letter by Johnson saying he believes that a delay will be a mistake. He vowed to introduce legislation needed to implement his agreement in Parliament next week. The Prime Minister was required by law to ask the EU for an extension to the 31st of October deadline after losing a Commons vote yesterday. Conservative lawmaker Oliver Letwin's proposal got 322 votes in favour and 306 against. The amendment has opened a window to push Brexit until the 31st of January next year. In Lebanon, a government party has quit the coalition after a third day of protests across the country against rising taxes and corruption. In a televised speech, Lebanese Forces Party head Samir Gaga said the government is unable to control the situation. The anti-government protests led to the resignation of 4 ministers in a major blow to the ruling coalition. But the resignations would not collapse the 30-member cabinet. The protesters in Beirut celebrated the news of the coalition party's resignation, calling on other blocs to leave the government. Prime Minister Saad Hariri has given a task to coalition partners to find ways to deal with the current crisis. The demonstrators are demanding a sweeping overhaul of Lebanon's political system, citing grievances from austerity measures to poor infrastructure. Indonesia's President Joko Widodo has been sworn in for a second 5-year term in Jakarta. The swearing-in was performed at the parliament under tight security of over 30,000 security personnel. In his second and final term, President Widodo has pledged to attract more investment into Southeast Asia's biggest economy. Several foreign dignitaries attended the ceremony, including Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. In Chile, 3 people have been killed by a fire inside a supermarket in Santiago as protests sparked over the metro ticket price hike. These are the first deaths in 2 days of violent unrest in which protesters burnt the city despite government curfews. Mayor Carla Rubilar says 2 people died at the scene and the third died in hospital. Soldiers and tanks were deployed after the government declared a state of emergency and imposed a night curfew. Clashes have erupted for the 20th consecutive weekend between Hong Kong police and protesters. Police fired tear gas at thousands of protesters, vandalizing subway stations and shops in rallies across the city. The protesters wore face masks in defiance of a ban that have a penalty of up to a year in prison. The demonstrators threw petrol bombs at a police station, and protesters blamed Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam for failing to protect their freedom. Hong Kong has witnessed months of protests sparked by a controversial extradition bill. In Spain, hundreds of anti-separation demonstrators have taken to the streets in Barcelona after a week of separatist unrest. The protesters called for an end to the violence, which started after the sentencing of pro-independence Catalan leaders. They said Spain's central government is not doing enough to end the chaos. Earlier, the Spanish government dismissed calls from Catalonia's regional president to negotiate peace. The Interior Ministry spokesman said that over 300 people have been detained since the protests started. Now in Switzerland, vote counting has begun after polling closed in the national elections to elect new members of both houses of the Federal Assembly. Multiple independent surveys show climate change has displaced migration as the top priority among the Swiss electorate. Opinion polls show the Swiss People's Party will remain the largest parliamentarian party with over 20% of the vote. But the governing party's support is down from 29% it enjoyed in 2015. The Green Party, which won just over 7% in 2015, is now backed by nearly 11% of voters. The Sotomo Political Research Institute said opinion polls point to a green wave during the vote. For decades, Thailand's beaches have been the most sought-out holiday destinations in Asia. However, this year, hotels are struggling to fill rooms, even on the popular seaside resort of Pattaya. Overall, the country has seen a drastic decline in tourists. More in this report.
Hotels on Thailand's most popular holiday island have been forced to slash prices with rooms left vacant and beaches sparse. This is because of plunge in Chinese visitors caused by the US trade war and a stronger baht.
I think it's since June, it's been the same every month, and it's after coming here for 15 low seasons, I've never seen anything as bad as what it is at the moment.
Tourism accounts for 18% of Thailand's gross domestic product, and Chinese holidaymakers make up more than a quarter of total arrivals. According to official figures, around 2.2 million people from the country visited in 2018. Numbers for January-September were down almost a fifth on year.
The number of tourists to Phuket may be the same as last year. It is not grow in the number, but the revenue still bigger than last year.
Looking to expand, the Thai tourist officials are now looking towards newer countries, but for now the lower arrivals is evident on the streets of Phuket.
New York City is known for its arts and culture scene. The Museum of Modern Art has been at the center of the Big Apple's eclectic art scene. The museum is set to reopen this month after an extensive multi-million-dollar makeover. More in this report.
Heralded MoMA reopens on 21st October after a multi-million-dollar makeover. MoMA, which moved here in 1939, has undergone remodeling 4 times to cope with a growing collection and increased footfall. This time the layout reflects the philosophy of the museum's first director, Alfred Barr.
When the Museum of Modern Art in 1939 built its first building, what distinguished that building most from previous institutions was it wasn't set in a park and it wasn't set up a flight of steps.
The upgrade cost $450 million. It means the museum will be able to exhibit around 2,400 works a year compared to an average of 1,500. For the first time, artworks will be displayed by theme rather than time period.
This notion of democratizing the museum, of making that whole ground floor visible everywhere and free, is very much part of this sort of character that we wanted to bring out together.
For people wanting to see Pablo Picasso's iconic works, his water lilies and the ladies of Avignon will always be on show.
Now in other news, a huge crowd of ghoulish dresses gathered in Mexico City to celebrate the 2019 Zombie Walk. The event features some of the best fan-made costumes, special effects and other props one's likely to see outside of Hollywood. More in this report.
Doused in fake blood, wearing torn clothing and masks, the zombies gathered at Mexico City's iconic Monument to the Revolution. A large number of families participate in the event annually, with even children often dressed up in costume. Thanks to the TV series like The Walking Dead and games like The Last of Us, the undead have become the de facto monster of supernatural pop culture.
It's really a cool experience because we get together more as a family and my children learned to socialize a little more.
Since 2007, Mexico City has been celebrating Zombie Walk annually for fun as well as benefiting food banks and charities for those in need.
After so much violence, after everything that happens in this country and this city, this zombie walk is a little distraction to have fun, to be with your family.
After the Zombie Model March began in California in 2001, the event has become an annual tradition around the world from Toronto to Singapore.
Well, I don't need to go to Mexico to see zombies. I've got some in my office. We'll be back right after this short break. Welcome back. Now in business news, the governor of Japan's central bank says he won't hesitate to ease key lending rates in response to heightened geopolitical risks. Bank of Japan chief Haruhiko Kuroda says he will also use other stimulus measures to guard against an economic downturn. More in this report.
As the world's third largest economy, Japan has benefited from strong growth in its top trading partners, China and the US. But their trade war and uncertainties by Brexit have weighed heavily on Japan this year. In an interview, the governor of Japan's central bank, Haruhiko Kuroda, has said geopolitical risks have already dragged on global economic growth. He said the Bank of Japan stands ready to act if the pressure builds any further.
If really we need further easing of monetary condition, then we would certainly reduce short, medium term interest rate, but we don't want to reduce super long range of interest rate.
Kuroda's remarks are the strongest signal to date that any further easing by the Bank of Japan would push its target lending rates deeper into negative territory. He said an increase in risky asset buying is another option to boost growth.
Also, we can expand our asset purchase program. Asset purchase program include not just long-term government bonds, but also, as you know, ETF as well as REITs. I think there are various measures, tools to affect the economy by easing monetary conditions.
International markets are rife with speculation that the Bank of Japan could take monetary easing measures at the end of the month.
Australia's Qantas Airlines has achieved a milestone by flying the longest non-stop passenger flight from New York to Sydney. The flight took 19 hours and 16 minutes to reach its destination. Qantas hopes to parlay this test into commercial success. This is the first of 3 ultra-long-haul journeys planned by the airline this year. Just 49 people travelled on the Boeing to minimise the weight on board and give the plane sufficient fuel without refuelling. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce called it a really historic moment for both the airline and world aviation. Well, it's 29 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but we'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.